Okay, so with 10%, we're going to take in number 14, where they're asking us to work with the number 46, move the decimal in one time, and the result is 4.6. And then when they ask us to find 1%, we're going to move the decimal in another time, and we get 0.46. So when I'm asked to find 32% here, I'm using 10 3 times, because that's 30%, and then 1% twice, which is going to get me the extra 2% for a total of 32%. 10, 20, 30, 31, 32. Now again, the nice thing is here we can kind of estimate if we want. So I don't really have to work with 4.6 and 0.46. What I would probably be prone to do is make these 4.5 and 0.5, because that's really easy. So 4.5 and 4.5 is 9, plus another 4.5 is 13.5. And then this is going to be a half, which is going to get me to 14 at 31%. And then another one of these guys is going to get me to 14 and a half. Let's try that again with number 18, 3% of 72. So I don't really need to even find 10%, but 10% is just kind of along the way here. 10% I'm going to take and move the decimal in once on 72, and so that's going to give me 7.2. And 1% is going to take and move it in one more time, so I'm going to get 0.72. So if I'm finding 3%, I'm using 1% 3 times here. So I'm going to go ahead and round this off to 0.75, which is the same as 3/4. And since I'm doing 3%, I'm going to do 0.72 plus 0.72 plus 0.72, or if you're rounding it, like I said, 0.75 plus 0.75 plus 0.75. Well, 3/4 plus 3/4 is 1.5, plus another 3/4 is going to give me 2.25. And again, you're more than welcome to do 0.72 plus 0.72 plus 0.72. In number 22, we're doing 18% of 147. So 10% there on 147 is going to move the decimal in one time. So that's going to give me 14.7. And then 1% there is going to give me, in this case, again, move the decimal one more time, 1.47. Now some of you might think I'm about to say, well, I'm going to do 10% and then do 1% 8 times. But that's actually not what I'm going to do, because that's a lot of calculations. I'm going to do 20%, and then I'm going to take off 1% twice to get me back down to 18%. Now again, we can estimate here, so I don't have to use these actual numbers. I can do a little bit of crafty rounding here. So I'm going to make this 15, and I'm going to make this 1.5, because they're really close. Again, the directions say estimate. They're not asking me to find the actual answer here. So I've got 15 and 15 to get me up here to 20%, which is going to give me 30. And then I'm going to subtract 20 rather, and then I'm going to subtract 1%, which I'm going to round to 1.5. So minus 1.5, and then minus 1.5 again to get me to 18%. 1% taken off twice, of course. 20 minus 1 and 1 is 18. So 30 minus 1.5 minus 1.5, or 3. 30 minus 3 is 27. All right, let's go ahead and go look over at 17, 21, and 25, which are on the far right side. In number 17, they're asking me to find 21% of 62. So 10% is going to take and move the decimal in one time at 6.2. 1% is going to move it in one more time, and that's going to give me 0.62. Now again, as we said, we're estimating here in these questions, so we can go ahead and round all we want. So in 10%, I'm going to round that off to a nice even 6. And 1%, I'm going to round that off to a half, or 0.5. It's not the best estimate in the world. I could do 0.6. It really wouldn't be that bad, but since we're estimating, I can get away with a lot of things here. I have a lot of flexibility. So I've got 10% twice, which will get me up to 20%, and then 1% for the final one to get me to 21%. 6 and 6 makes 12, plus a half is 12.5. All right, number 21 says 65% of 124. So I'm going to find 10% here. 10% is going to move the decimal in one time to give me 12.4. And 1% here is going to move the decimal in one more time, and that's going to give me 1.24. Now, because this is such a large percentage, what you might also be well off to do is find 50%. Because that's going to get me a lot closer to 65% very quickly. Even though the directions don't say that, it's okay. 50% is just half of what you've got. So half of 124. Well, half of 124 is 62. And that's going to help me because now I'm going to do 50% and 10% and then 1% 5 times. Now I'm going to go ahead and do some rounding here. I'm going to round 12.4 off to 12. I'm going to round 1.24 off to 1. 62, I can work with that. That's a whole number, an integer. It really doesn't change a whole lot for me. I can work with that one just like it is. So 50%, 62. 10%, which we said was going to be 12, and then 1% 5 times, that's the 5% more I need to get to 65%, but we rounded that to 1. So if I'm using 1 5 times, that's 5. So I've got 62 and 12, which is 74, plus 5, which is 79. All right, we've got one more to go, 2% of 188. So I've got 10% and 1% here. 10% is going to take and move the decimal in one time. We end up with 18.8. 1% is going to move it in one more time, and I'm going to get 1.88. Now again, since we're estimating, I can do some rounding here. I don't really want to work with 1.88. I'll change that to a 2. I'm not going to touch 10% because it's asking me only to find 2%. So I need 1% and 1% because that's how I get to 2%. Well, 1% is about 2. That's 2 and 2, which makes 4.